My daughter drew a picture of me at work last Tuesday. She's 7. The picture showed a man in a blue coat standing next to a tall rectangle, a door, I think, and behind the door she'd drawn what looked like a hallway stretching back and back and back, narrowing to a point. The hallway was filled with small circles. Dozens of them. All with faces. I asked her what the circles were. She said, "The people you take care of, Daddy." I don't take care of people. I calibrate gas chromatography equipment for a pharmaceutical shelf stability program. That's what I told my wife when I took this job. That's what I told my daughter. But that's not what I do. I need to explain how this started. The listing appeared on a specialized recruitment board for laboratory technicians with ISO 17025 accreditation. I'd been working contract positions for 6 years, toxicology labs, environmental compliance, one stint with a food safety outfit in Michigan that paid well but involved a 90-minute commute each way. My wife, Renata, was pregnant with our second child at the time, and the posting offered something I hadn't seen in contract work before, a permanent salary position with full benefits, pension contribution, and a location less than 20 minutes from our house in suburban Maryland. The employer was listed as Caraway Research Group. I'd never heard of them, which wasn't unusual. Subcontractors in the pharmaceutical testing space are numerous, unglamorous, and largely invisible to the public. The job description was straightforward. Analytical Laboratory Technician, Level 3. Maintain and calibrate instrumentation. Prepare reference standards. Verify environmental controls. Standard GLP compliance documentation. I applied. I interviewed in a nondescript office park off Route 32, one of those two-story beige buildings with a shared parking lot and no signage indicating what happens inside. The interview was conducted by a woman named Dr. Elaine Royce, who asked technically competent questions about method validation, instrument qualification protocols, and documentation integrity. She was unhurried, precise, and entirely uninterested in small talk. I was offered the position 4 days later. My start date was March 3rd. The first thing I learned was that the office park was not my workplace. On my first morning, I drove to the same building where I'd interviewed, presented my credentials at a small reception desk, and was directed to a shuttle van in the rear parking lot. There were 3 other people in the van. None of them spoke to me. The driver took us approximately 9 miles northwest along a county road, then turned onto an unmarked paved access road that descended gradually for about a quarter mile before terminating at a concrete structure built into the side of a low, wooded hill. The structure had no signage. The entrance was a set of double doors, steel, painted gray, flanked by a single camera and a badge reader. The driver let us out without comment and pulled away immediately. Inside, the facility was clean, well-lit, and architecturally unremarkable. Polished concrete floors, acoustic ceiling tiles, fluorescent lighting. It could have been a hospital basement or a university research wing. I was met by a man named Gerald Tsai, who introduced himself as the operations coordinator and handed me a laminated badge, a key ring with 2 keys, and a thin orientation binder. The binder was 16 pages. Most of it was standard. Emergency evacuation routes. PPE requirements by zone. Waste segregation protocol. Break schedule. Reporting structure. Pages 13 through 16 were different. They were printed on heavier stock, off-white, slightly textured, and the header on each page read Operational Compliance, Environmental Sensitivity Parameters. The language was dense and euphemistic, but after reading it twice in the small orientation room Gerald left me in, I understood that it described 4 behavioral constraints applicable to all personnel working below Level 2. The constraints were not called rules. They were referred to as environmentally responsive protocols and framed as protective measures to preserve sample integrity. But they were rules. And they were strange. The first constraint stated that all personnel must vocalize continuously while transiting Corridor D between the hours of 0100 and 0500. The vocalization could be speech, humming, counting, or recitation, but silence in that corridor during those hours was a non-compliance event subject to immediate review. The second constraint stated that no personnel may acknowledge, respond to, or visually track any movement observed in peripheral vision within Laboratory Suite 7. Direct gaze was permitted. Peripheral registration was to be actively suppressed. The protocol recommended deliberate saccadic correction toward a fixed central point whenever peripheral disturbance was noted. The third constraint stated that all written documentation produced within the facility must be initiated with the technician's full legal name in their own handwriting before any other content was recorded. Digital entries were exempt. But any handwritten note, label, form, or annotation, even a single word on a sticky note, required the full name first. The fourth constraint stated that no personnel may remain stationary in any location for longer than 4 continuous minutes without producing a physical sound, a footstep, a drawer opening, a cough, a tap. 4 minutes of motionless silence triggered what the binder called an environmental recognition event, and required the individual to immediately relocate to the nearest designated reset point and log the incident. I read these 4 times. Then Gerald returned, asked if I had questions, and when I began to ask about page 13, he said, pleasantly, without any change in demeanor, "Those are environmental sensitivity protocols. They're for sample integrity. You'll get used to them within the first week." Everyone does. I asked what happened during an environmental recognition event. Gerald looked at me with an expression I've spent 2 years trying to categorize. It wasn't fear. It wasn't discomfort. It was something closer to the look a parent gives a child who has asked where meat comes from, a calculation about how much truth the moment can hold. "Nothing happens to you," he said. "The environment responds. The protocols prevent that response. That's all you need." I want to be clear about something. I am not a credulous person. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't watch horror movies. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry and 6 years of professional laboratory experience. When I read those protocols, my first assumption was that this was either an eccentricity of management, like the pharmaceutical company in New Jersey that required all employees to remove their shoes on Fridays, or a poorly explained safety measure related to vibration-sensitive equipment or acoustic interference with some analytical process I hadn't yet encountered. For the first 3 weeks, I chose the latter interpretation. I hummed in Corridor D during the early hours, though my shift rarely kept me there past midnight. I kept my eyes forward in Suite 7. I wrote my name on everything. I shuffled my feet every few minutes when I was standing still. I did these things the way you put on safety goggles in a teaching lab, compliance without conviction. My work was real. The instrumentation was real. I calibrated HPLCs. I ran dissolution testing. I verified temperature and humidity loggers. The samples I handled were pharmaceutical, tablets, capsules, stability pulls from various ICH storage conditions. The documentation was rigorous, and the oversight was credible. Whatever was odd about the protocols, the actual laboratory science was legitimate and well managed. I worked with 11 other technicians across 2 shifts. The day shift had 7 of us. The night shift had 5. We shared the same laboratories but rarely overlapped except during the 45-minute handoff window. My immediate colleagues were professionals, quiet, competent, and disinclined toward speculation. Nobody talked about the protocols. When I mentioned them casually to a woman named Priya during our second week, she gave me a look very similar to the one Gerald had produced and said, "They work. Just follow them." That was March. By April, I had incorporated the protocols into my muscle memory the way you internalize any lab habit: gloves before touching anything, logbook open before starting a run, name at the top of every page. The protocols became invisible through repetition. What did not become invisible was Suite 7. Laboratory Suite 7 was physically identical to the other 6 suites in the facility. Same dimensions. Same bench layout. Same fume hood configuration. Same flooring, same lighting, same HVAC register placement. It was used primarily for force degradation studies, stress testing pharmaceutical compounds under extreme conditions to identify degradation pathways. UV exposure. Acid and base hydrolysis. Oxidative stress. Thermal cycling. I worked in Suite 7 approximately 3 times per week. The second protocol, the one about peripheral vision, applied only there. For the first several weeks, I noticed nothing. My work in Suite 7 was identical to my work anywhere else: prepare samples, run instruments, record data, maintain environmental logs. The lighting was adequate. The ventilation was standard. The temperature held at 21.5 degrees Celsius plus or minus 0.3, verified twice daily. In the 4th week, I noticed something in my peripheral vision for the first time. I was standing at the HPLC bench, loading vials into the autosampler carousel. My gaze was fixed on the vial positions, small, precise work requiring attention. And in the leftmost edge of my visual field, near the base of fume hood C, something shifted. Not moved. Shifted. Like the visual equivalent of a radio station drifting slightly off frequency, a wrongness in the texture of the space rather than an object traversing it. I did not look. I corrected my gaze toward the carousel, as the protocol instructed. The shift subsided. I finished loading the vials. I started the sequence. I left Suite 7 and walked to the break room and sat down for 4 minutes with my hands around a cup of coffee, and I noticed that my hands were trembling. Not from fear. From effort. The effort of not looking. Because in the half-second before I corrected my gaze, some part of my visual cortex had begun assembling information about what was there. And what it was assembling, before I shut it down, before training overrode instinct, was a shape that did not belong to any object in that laboratory. I want to be precise. I did not see a figure. I did not see a face. I did not see anything I could name. What I experienced was my brain's edge detection system flagging a geometric impossibility, a form that occupied 3-dimensional space but did not resolve into any known category of object. It was there the way an afterimage is there, not as presence but as interference. And I did not look at it. By June, I had experienced peripheral events in Suite 7 approximately 40 times. I had looked directly at the space in question on perhaps a dozen occasions, always after correcting my gaze first, always turning my head fully rather than sliding my eyes sideways. Every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. Hood C. The bench. The wall behind it. Normal. Every time I corrected without looking, the interference subsided within 2 to 3 seconds. I began to understand, viscerally, what the protocol was protecting me from. Not from something that would hurt me if I saw it. From something that existed only in the architecture of peripheral vision, that was assembled by the brain's edge detection system and could not survive direct observation. Looking at it didn't reveal it. Looking at it denied it the only medium in which it could exist. This understanding did not make me less afraid. It made me more afraid in a way I could not articulate, because it meant the thing, whatever it was not in the room. It was in the seeing. In the specific computational process by which a human brain detects shapes at the edge of attention. I followed the protocol. I always followed the protocol. But I started dreaming about what would happen if I didn't. In August, a new technician was hired. His name was Marcus Achebe. He was young, 26, and had come from a university research lab where he'd been doing proteomics work. He was smart, precise, and curious in the way that new hires at legitimate scientific facilities are supposed to be curious. Gerald gave him the same orientation binder. Marcus read it. Marcus asked the same questions I had asked. I was assigned to shadow him for his first 2 weeks. On his 3rd day, we were in Suite 7 together. I was showing him the dissolution bath calibration procedure, temperature verification, paddle speed confirmation, media preparation. Routine work. He was taking notes. At 10:47 a.m., I saw his pen stop moving. His eyes were fixed on a point approximately 40 degrees to his left. His head hadn't turned. His body was still. But his eyes, I could see them from where I stood, had drifted leftward, tracking something. Marcus, I said. He didn't respond. Marcus. Eye center. His pupils were dilated. Not enormously, but visibly. His pen was still touching the page. His mouth was slightly open. Marcus. I reached out and put my hand on his forearm. The contact startled him, a full-body twitch, and his gaze snapped back to his notebook. Sorry, he said. Sorry. What is that? Don't describe it, I said. I said it before I knew I was going to say it. It came from somewhere beneath professional courtesy, beneath rational thought. It came from the same place that makes you grab a child's arm at a curb. He looked at me. Just center your gaze. Pick a fixed point. Keep your eyes there. There's something by the... I know, I said. Don't describe it. Don't look at it. Don't track it. Pick a point. Hold it. He stared at me for a long time. Then he looked down at his notebook and very carefully continued writing. That night, I checked the environmental log for Suite 7. The temperature, humidity, and particulate readings for 10:47 a.m. were all within specification. There was no anomaly recorded. There never was. Marcus lasted 9 months. I want to tell you about those 9 months in a way that conveys what it was actually like to work beside someone who was slowly failing to comply with a protocol that had no rational basis and no visible consequence for violation, until it did. For the first 4 months, Marcus followed the protocols correctly. He hummed in Corridor D. He wrote his name on everything. He moved regularly. He kept his gaze centered in Suite 7. But he was thinking about it. I could tell because I was thinking about it too, and I recognized the symptoms. The distraction. The way your attention kept drifting toward the question rather than the work. The conversations that circled the topic without landing on it. In his 5th month, Marcus started asking the other technicians about Suite 7. Most gave him the same non-answer Priya had given me. But one, a night shift tech named Solomon, told Marcus something I hadn't known. Solomon had been there 11 years. He was the longest tenured technician in the facility. And he told Marcus, told both of us, because I was in the break room when it happened, that the protocols had not always been 4. When I started, Solomon said, there were 6. He didn't elaborate. He didn't tell us what the other 2 had been. He just said that they had been retired, that was his word, retired, in 2016 and 2019 respectively, and that the facility had been better since. Marcus asked what better meant. Solomon finished his coffee, rinsed his mug, and said, quieter. In his 7th month, Marcus began keeping a secondary notebook. This was a violation of documentation protocol. All facility records were to be produced in controlled logbooks, serialized and issued by the quality unit. Unauthorized notebooks were prohibited not by the strange protocols but by standard GLP requirements. But Marcus kept one. I saw it in his bag once when he was changing in the locker area. A small black moleskine with a red elastic band. He saw me see it and neither of us said anything. I think he was recording the peripheral events. Cataloging them. Time, duration, position in the room, characteristics. I think he was trying to build a dataset. I think he was trying to see if it was getting closer. In his 8th month, Marcus told me something during a smoke break. Neither of us smoked, but the outdoor area behind the facility's surface structure was the only place without cameras that I have not been able to forget. It responds to attention, he said. Not to looking. To thinking about it. The more time I spend analyzing the events, the more frequent they become. I graphed it. There's a direct correlation between my logged cognitive engagement and event density the following day. I told him to stop recording. I can't, he said. Because here's the thing, the events aren't random. They're not environmental. They're adaptive. The geometry changes based on who's in the room. When it's just me, it's at the edge of my specific visual field, my astigmatism, my particular blind spot. When you're there, it's in a different position. It's calibrated to individual observers. I told him to stop recording. And it's learning, he said. It's moving closer to the center. 2 degrees per month. At this rate, it enters the foveal field in. Stop. I grabbed his arm. Marcus. Stop. He looked at me with an expression I have thought about every day since. It was not fear. It was not obsession. It was clarity, the terrible, clean clarity of someone who has seen a pattern and cannot unsee it. 14 months, he said. For me. Longer for you because you don't track it. But eventually it reaches direct vision for both of us. The protocol doesn't prevent it. It delays it. I should tell you about Corridor D. Corridor D connected the main laboratory wing to a section of the facility I had no access to. My key ring opened laboratories 1 through 7, the break room, the document storage room, and the locker area. Beyond the locked door at the end of Corridor D, I had never been. The first protocol, continuous vocalization between O100 and O500, applied only in this corridor. I rarely transited it during those hours because my shift typically ended at midnight. But twice during my tenure, I was asked to perform overnight environmental monitoring checks, 24-hour stability polls that required readings at 0200 and 0400. On both occasions, I walked corridor D while humming. The corridor was approximately 40 meters long, fluorescent lit, with sealed doors on both sides, doors I could not open and had never seen anyone else open. The floor was the same polished concrete as everywhere else. The ceiling was the same acoustic tile. There was nothing visually wrong with it. But during my second overnight, July of my first year, I stopped humming for approximately 3 seconds. Not intentionally. I had been counting under my breath, a habit I developed for compliance, and I lost my place. Just a brief lapse. 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I heard something. Not a sound in the way that footsteps or machinery are sounds. A shift in the acoustic quality of the corridor itself. As if the air pressure had changed. As if the space had noticed the silence and expanded into it, not physically, but attentionally. The way a room feels larger when you close your eyes. I started humming again immediately. The shift subsided. But in that 3-second window, I had the distinct impression, not a thought, not a perception, an impression, that the corridor was longer than it had been when I entered it. That the door at the far end, which I could see clearly, had receded by some unmeasurable fraction. Not enough to confirm. Just enough to doubt. I walked at the same pace. I reached the door in the same number of steps. Everything was normal. But I never lost count again. In Marcus's 9th month, November of my second year, he violated the second protocol. I was not there. I was in Laboratory 3, running a routine assay. What I know comes from the incident report, from the security footage I was later shown, and from what I heard through the wall. The security footage shows Marcus in Suite 7 alone at 14:23. He is standing at the bench near Fume Hood C, the location where peripheral events are most frequently experienced. He is not working. His hands are at his sides. His body is oriented toward the bench, but his head is turned approximately 30 degrees to the left. He is looking at it. Not peripherally. Not at the edge of his vision. He has turned his head. He is looking directly at the space where it should not be visible through direct gaze. For the first 4 seconds, nothing happens. He stands motionless, looking. At second 5, his posture changes. His shoulders drop. His hands come up slightly, palms forward, in a gesture that looks like either surprise or defense. At second 8, he steps backward. 1 step. At second 9, the footage becomes difficult to describe. The camera is ceiling mounted, pointed downward at approximately 35 degrees. It shows the full room. Nothing in the room changes. No shape appears. No object moves. The lighting remains constant. The equipment remains static. But Marcus's shadow changes. It shortens. Not as if the light source had moved, the overhead fluorescents are fixed, but as if he had become taller without becoming taller. His shadow compresses toward his feet while his body remains the same height. It takes approximately 2 seconds. At second 11, Marcus makes a sound. I heard this through the wall. It was not a scream. It was not a word. It was a sound I have only ever heard once, and it was the sound a person makes when they attempt to inhale and exhale simultaneously, a locked, pressurized, airless noise that communicates more distress than any scream because it is involuntary. The body making that sound is not choosing to make it. At second 12, Marcus sits down. Slowly. Controlled. He sits on the floor with his legs straight out and his back against the bench, and he looks straight ahead at the far wall, and he does not move. Gerald and 2 security personnel entered Suite 7 within 90 seconds. By the time they reached Marcus, he was responsive, eyes tracking, answering questions, standing when asked. He appeared physically unharmed. His vitals, checked by the on-site medic, were within normal limits except for a heart rate of 131. He was escorted from the facility. I never saw him again. What I saw in the footage, the shadow compression, I have thought about for 7 months. I have watched that footage 3 times. Twice in Gerald's office and once during what was called a compliance reinforcement session with Dr. Royce. What I think happened, and I want to be careful to distinguish between observation and interpretation, is that Marcus, by looking directly at the phenomenon while simultaneously being aware of it through the peripheral system, created a kind of observational paradox. The protocol says don't look with your peripheral vision. The implication I had always carried was that direct gaze was safe. That direct gaze dissolved the phenomenon. But Marcus's research suggested the phenomenon was migrating toward direct vision regardless. That the protocol was delay, not prevention. And what he may have done, what the footage suggests, is that he looked at it after it had migrated close enough to survive his direct attention. He saw it. And it saw him seeing it. And the shadow compression, the impossible geometric change in his shadow, was not the phenomenon becoming visible. It was the phenomenon and Marcus's visual system resolving each other simultaneously. It was mutual observation. The thing that exists only in the process of being seen reached a point where it could sustain itself under direct gaze, and in that moment, the seeing became bidirectional. I don't know what that means for the body. For the brain. For whatever produces the sense of looking outward through your own eyes. I don't know what Marcus experienced. But I know that when Gerald showed me the footage during my compliance reinforcement session, he paused it at second 5, the moment Marcus's posture changed, and said something that has restructured my entire understanding of this facility. He said, "This is what happens when a protocol stops being sufficient. Not violated. Sufficient." I asked Gerald, for the first time in 2 years, what was behind the door at the end of Corridor D. What was in the section of the facility I had no access to. Gerald sat back in his chair. He looked at me the way he had on my first day, that calculating parental expression, but older now, more tired. I had the sudden realization that Gerald was afraid. Not of me. Not of the question. Of the answer. The facility was built in 1987, he said. Originally for materials research. Defense contract. The first 3 levels are what you've seen. Standard laboratory space. The 4th level was sealed in 2003. What's on it? Nothing, now, he said. It was evacuated in 2003 and sealed. The protocols, the 4 you follow, are the boundary conditions we identified for preventing what's down there from extending beyond its current range. Its current range is Suite 7. Its current range is this entire building, Gerald said. Suite 7 is where it manifests because Suite 7 is directly above the sealed level. But it's present everywhere. The protocols don't limit its location. They limit its ability to cohere. I stared at him. Continuous vocalization in Corridor D prevents acoustic coherence. Physical movement every 4 minutes prevents spatial fixation. Your written name at the beginning of every document anchors your cognitive identity in a form it cannot process. And peripheral suppression in Suite 7 prevents the optical feedback loop that allows it to establish observational reciprocity. What is it? We don't know. Gerald said this without shame or evasion. Nobody who worked on the fourth level between 1987 and 2003 is available for consultation. The documentation from that period was removed by the contracting agency. What we have are the protocols, which were delivered to us in 2003 by a party we are not authorized to identify, and the empirical observation that compliance maintains containment. And when compliance becomes insufficient? Gerald didn't answer that. I went home that night and watched my daughter, 7 years old, asleep, her face slack with the absolute trust of a child who has never doubted the structural integrity of the world, and I thought about the fact that whatever is in that facility exists in the process of being seen. That it feeds on, or lives in, or is constituted by, the computational act by which a human brain assembles visual information at the edge of attention. And I thought about what Marcus had said. That it was migrating 2 degrees per month toward center vision. That the protocol was delay, not prevention. And I thought about Solomon, who had been there 11 years, and who had told us that 2 protocols had been retired. Retired. Not because they became unnecessary. Because the phenomenon had moved past the point they addressed. 6 protocols became 4. Not because the threat diminished. Because the threat advanced past the territory those protocols covered, making them obsolete. The boundary didn't shrink because things got better. The boundary shrank because what it held back had already crossed those former lines and established them as its own territory. Suite 7 used to require 6 constraints to remain workable. Now it only requires 4. Not because it's safer. Because it already owns the other 2. It's now March. 2 years since I started. I am still employed at the facility. I still calibrate instruments and run stability assays and follow the 4 protocols with mechanical precision. But 3 weeks ago, I experienced a peripheral event in Laboratory 3. Not Suite 7. Laboratory 3. A room where the second protocol has never applied. A room 2 floors above the sealed level, on the opposite end of the building from the area directly over whatever is down there. I was loading a sample into the UV vis spectrophotometer. My gaze was fixed on the cuvette holder. And in my peripheral vision, in the rightmost edge, near the door, something shifted. I corrected my gaze. I did not look. It subsided. I walked to the break room. I sat down. My hands were not trembling. They were perfectly still. And that scared me more than the trembling ever had, because it meant I was becoming accustomed. It meant the event was normalizing. It meant my startle response, the basic physiological alarm that says something is wrong, had been trained into silence by 2 years of successful suppression. The thing was in Laboratory 3. The boundary had moved. And my body had decided that this was fine. I have not reported the event. I have not told Gerald. I have not told anyone at the facility. Because if I report it, one of 2 things happens. Either they extend the second protocol to all laboratories, which tells me the migration is accelerating and has been anticipated, or they tell me it's always been in all laboratories and I simply never perceived it before. I don't know which answer is worse. I don't know whether Marcus was right that attention feeds it, and my 2 years of strict suppression kept it contained to Suite 7 for me personally, and now my single involuntary registration in Lab 3 has given it a new foothold in my visual field outside the designated zone. I don't know whether my daughter's drawing, the hallway full of circles with faces, came from her imagination or from something she perceived at the edge of her 7-year-old vision during one of the 3 times she visited me in the parking lot of the surface building. I don't know whether it can travel with me. The 4th protocol, no stillness longer than 4 minutes, applies inside the facility. But last Sunday, I was sitting on my back porch watching my daughter play in the yard, and I sat motionless for over 10 minutes. Just watching her. Not moving. Not making a sound. Just looking at her directly while the rest of the yard existed in my peripheral vision. And at minute 6, in the leftmost edge of my sight, near the fence line where the neighbor's oaks cast a shadow, I corrected my gaze. I looked directly at my daughter. There was nothing at the fence line. There never is. Tomorrow morning, I'll drive to the office park. I'll take the shuttle. I'll badge into the gray doors. I'll write my full legal name at the top of every page. I'll hum in Corridor D. I'll move every 4 minutes. I'll keep my eyes fixed on my work in Suite 7, and I will not look at what is building itself in the margins of my attention. And next Tuesday, when my daughter shows me another drawing, I will look at it directly. I will look at it with my full attention, with my foveal vision, with every photoreceptor in the center of my retina. Because as long as I am looking directly at something, it cannot be there. That's what the protocol promises. That's what the protocol promised Marcus, too. Until it became insufficient. I'm writing this with my full legal name at the top of the document. I'm writing this in a room where I have been moving every 3 minutes. I'm writing this while my wife watches television in the next room and my daughter sleeps upstairs and the house is filled with the small sounds of a family living. And I am not going to look at what I can see in the upper left corner of this screen. I'm not going to look. I'm not going to look. I'm